Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be doing another video in the continuing series of director commentaries, and today I want to cover a personal favorite of mine, which is Guillermo Del Toro. Now, I think everybody should know Guillermo Del Toro, or most people. You've probably seen a film that he's done, or at least have heard of them. He's done, a lot of things from big budget to small budget, but we're just going to go over some of his early stuff. So he was originally, when he was young and making student films, he so originally when he was making student films, he actually befriended and did some studying under famous makeup effects artist Dick Smith, who did The Exorcist, and he did a lot of other movies. He did Scanners, which I've talked about on this channel before, and many others. And so I'm going to kind of divide up Del Toro's career into kind of really two major segments, and then discuss two of his later films, which I feel kind of contrast each other. Now, in his early days, he started doing films. And he still did for a little while, which were films in foreign language, and some of them like Pan's Labyrinth, for example, or not Pan's Labyrinth, Devil's Backbone, for example, which was in a foreign language for the most part of it because it's supposed to take place in Spain. But let's just start out with his first film, which is Cronos. Now, Cronos is really where Del Toro started doing his kind of his idea of his horror aspect, and you can really tell Del Toro's horror because it involves a lot of like these fantastical monsters and this the very haunting visuals and stuff like that. He's not really so much of a subtle guy. He's not one of those guys that's going to like hide the monster behind behind a door for half the movie, and then you'll see it at the end. He really just shows it to you, and he shows you it in all of its horror, but he makes you understand it. And Cronos is again one of those movies where you kind of see the start of that in that idea that, and a lot of his films follow this kind of narrative where his films are almost like watching a film version of a fairy tale. In a lot of ways, you can see kind of comparisons to some of his films with stuff like Ridley Scott's Legend and stuff of that nature, where it's this kind of fantastical thing, but it also is mixed in with horror in a lot of cases, and I'll get to that. But Cronos is a good example, and then he also, even though it was his first feature film, he started working with Ron Perlman, which he would develop a long-lasting friendship with that still lasts to this day, and Ron Perlman's been in a number of Del Toro's projects. Now, after Cronos, he went and he did another movie that was relatively successful called Mimic. Now, Mimic is a very bizarre film. It's about basically giant cockroaches, or cockroaches that develop into like giant humanoid type cockroaches. And proceed to go around and start killing people and dragging them down into the subway and stuff like that. And again, we see the horror vibe with this, like we did with Cronos. And Mimic is really one of those films where it's like it went into that idea of kind of that grotesque nature that horror sometimes goes into. Again, it's kind of like the creature in the shadows. And he did a very good job with kind of establishing that whole thing, and the idea of the roaches mimicking people and stuff like that. And they've mimicked to the point where they can make themselves look like people in trench coats, and they can go up onto the surface and they can kidnap people and kill them. Very, very interesting film, and I'd recommend it as a watch. It's not too long. I think it's only about an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes. And again, I wouldn't watch the sequels because the sequels all kind of suck. But the original one that he did, I think, is very good. And again, it has kind of that aspect of the fairy tale vibe where it's like, the dark forest, but instead of the dark forest, it's the dark sewer, and these creatures come and they take you away into the dark place. Again, it's kind of that idea that goes along with the similar tones in a fairy tale, and you can see those comparisons in a lot of his work. Now, one that I know he stated in the past was a very personal project was The Devil's Backbone. And The Devil's Backbone is, it's very, very creepy, but it's also one of those movies that, again, and I think this is one of the first times, again, where he really makes you understand the ghosts and the spirits as opposed to just having them there to scare you. Like, they are there to scare you, but again, he makes them to the point where you understand, and you're not, after a little while you get used to it. But it's supposed to be about the Spanish Civil War and this hospital, and this child is being haunted by this ghost of a little boy. And really, I've said this in the past as well, but I mean, I originally heard Del Toro say this in an interview, and this is kind of what really changed my viewpoint on it, is the Hollywood depiction of children. And he stated that he hates that idea of like this brainless depiction of children where they don't really, all they do is spout one-liners, and they don't really, they're very two-dimensional. They're not three-dimensional characters. They don't feel like people. They feel like, stand-ins to do stuff. And he really never liked that idea, and he tried to purvey that. He tried to show that in The Devil's Backbone, where he shows, in his own words, I believe he says, how unsavory it is sometimes to be a child. And again, this is a man who grew up around, I believe it was Guadalupe, Mexico. So I mean, he's probably familiar with the idea of certain the downtrodden areas and dealing with kids and stuff like that. I mean, but The Devil's Backbone, I think, is probably, out of his projects, it feels like the most personal of his projects. And now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to another project that he did a little later on, mainly because it fits in with the horror aspect of his work, and that's going to be Pan's Labyrinth. And Pan's Labyrinth is, again, it's a very it's a dark film, even though it doesn't necessarily 100% fall into the horror vein like The Devil's Backbone. You really have to watch the film to kind of understand it blurs the lines between reality and fantasy, and it's kind of that idea, like, kids are still going to have fairy tales even though real things might be happening around them. Children tend to see things that adults don't, or adults choose not to. And that's kind of the idea of Pan's Labyrinth, is the idea that, there's this fantastical story going on to the backdrop of real, actual human struggle. And, obviously, during most of the movie, sometimes you can't tell whether or not that tale is real, or whether or not it is a figment of someone's imagination until the end of the film, when you're kind of given mostly a clear view of what it actually is. So, Pan's Labyrinth is, again, I think, again, that is one of Del Toro's better, or at least one of his best films. And I would 100% guarantee you should give that a watch along with The Devil's Backbone, because both of those movies are very good. They are, I don't believe they have a dubbing. I believe they're both in Spanish, so you would have to read subtitles. But again, they are well worth it. And now that we're done with those, I'm going to move into Del Toro's. Really, he went on, which is kind of an inspiration for one of his later films, which I'll go into in more detail, is his superhero films. Now, Del Toro came in, and this is early in his timeline. This is, I believe, it was after Devil's Backbone. It was when he did Blade 2. Now, Blade 2, obviously you're carrying on from the original film, but they've gotten a different director now, and they would also get a different director for the third film because they couldn't get Del Toro to come back. At the time, I believe he was working on something. I believe he was working on Hellboy at the time. But Blade 2 is an extremely well done film, and it shows the makeup effects, which Del Toro had loved from his days with Dick Smith, and it also shows that his kind of love for the superhero genre and the fantastical. And obviously Blade is not necessarily, especially in the films, isn't really a contemporary superhero. He doesn't run around in tights or anything like that. And he murders vampires. Uh, but again, you see that Del Toro kind of weaves his little thread through, and as we see again, he reinvents the Blade films, and he does what you do with a good sequel: is he ramps everything up to 11. First movie, all right, Blade versus vampires, then you have a blood god or whatever it is at the end, but he's killed, so now you're kind of back to normal, and the whole movie you see Blade slaughtering vampires left and right for the most part. And now you have this one, and you have the Reaper strain vampires, which are taking vampires up to 11, and now you can't kill them with the silver bullets. You have to try, and you can only kill them with sunlight, and yada yada yada. And it really makes all the difference in the movie, because you feel that there is an actual sense of a sense of dread for Blade. Whereas in the first one, there really wasn't a whole lot of it. I mean, at the end, somewhat, but really, you felt that he could kind of get out of those situations pretty easily. In this, it doesn't necessarily feel like that. And then, of course, you have Ron Perlman coming back, who had been in Kronos, and he again, does a great job in this film. He plays a good bad guy. He has probably some of the best lines in the film, and he had very good interactions with Wesley Snipes. So you have that, and then we move into really what was Del Toro's superhero baby, which was Hellboy. Now Hellboy, which is based off the comic by Mike Mignola, is at the time was not very well known when the film was being made, when the film came out. And really, superhero movies, a lot of them were in their infancy. I mean, you saw, at the time, obviously, you had Blade 2, which Hellboy came out in 2004, by the way, and Blade 2 in 2002. You had Spider-Man in 2002. You had X-Men in 2000, and then X2, I believe, in 2002 or 2003. And then I think this was a year before Spider-Man 2 would come out in 2005. But you had kind of the start of the superhero film, so the original Hellboy kind of got in on the ground floor. But the original Hellboy does a great job at adapting one of the story's comic arcs. And Del Toro puts very entertaining visuals on screen. You have the Samael character, which his fight with Hellboy is really, really good. You have Ron Perlman coming back again in another Del Toro film to play Hellboy, which again I think he did very, very well. And I would have loved to have seen him to come back for a third Hellboy movie if we did not get a remake. But you have that. You have the great acting from William Hurt, who plays Dr. Breckenholm. And Del Toro kind of does this thing with these movies where the Hellboy movies, but they feel like you're watching a fairy tale. And I know I've said that more than once already, but it really does feel like that, because all of the bright colors and the fantastical elements and the humor and the atmosphere, it all kind of feels like that. It feels like you're reading a thing out of a grim fairy tale book. And to be honest, the Hellboy comics feel a lot like that too. And he did a very good job of kind of capturing that idea, or that feeling, that mood from the comic books, the way that the art kind of accentuates that. And with Hellboy 1 and Hellboy 2, well, Hellboy 2 more so, because that dives into more fantastical elements. Hellboy 1 kind of gets you in on the ground level, like, okay, some weird crap's going on, but you still have the real world, and there's a lot of shots of the real world. Then in the second one, you go full on into the fairy tale mode, where you have elves and all these myths and stuff like that, and magical items, and all this other stuff. So again, it goes into those films. And apparently, Guillermo Del Toro also has a weird fascination with the Abe Sapien character, which I'll get to later on. Now, I'm going to talk about Del Toro's my favorite film by Guillermo Del Toro, a film I've probably seen upwards of 50 times. That I have it on. I bought it on DVD as soon as I could. I saw it twice when it was in theaters, and that is Pacific Rim. And some people might laugh at me for saying, out of all of his films, that's my favorite. Considering that the competition, stuff like Pan's Labyrinth or Devil's Backbone or Hellboy. But Pacific Rim really, Guillermo del Toro sold you on giant robots beating up giant monsters. He sold you on it. You can't name me another director. Well, actually, maybe James Cameron could sell me on that if he was, old James Cameron. But a modern director selling an audience on something like that is insane. It's an insane idea. It's something out of anime or a Godzilla movie. It's really something that we associate more with Japanese culture in a lot of ways, especially with the giant mecha stuff and giant monsters. But he sells you on it, and he sells you on it in a very good way. And really, I enjoy Charlie Hunnam in this. I think he does a really good job. Idris Elba does an amazing job. The other members of the supporting cast do very well in this movie, and it's a fun movie. And he goes a little bit bonkers with it. There is a scene where a robot has a jet on its elbow, and it uses it to punch a monster in the face. That is awesome. I've never seen that in a movie before, and it took somebody like Guillermo del Toro to think that idea up, where you have a rocket elbow on a robot. And it's insanely entertaining. The giant robot and monster fights, they have weight to them. They feel like they have weight to them, even though they're CGI. You feel like these are real things that are moving around in this universe, and they're walking through buildings, and they're punching each other, and they're ripping each other apart. It feels real, and that's why he does a good job. Now, there are some weak points in that movie. I will say that the comic relief from Charlie Day, and I can't remember the actor who plays the other scientist, Herman, but it can be off sometimes. And again, Ron Perlman has a hilarious cameo in this movie as well. But I think that ultimately the Pacific Rim was an amazing film. I'm really sorry he did not come back for the sequel. I think if he had, it would have been a better product. I did enjoy the sequel, but not as much as the original. And I think it was kind of, even though they tried to do a lot of things, and I could tell that there were some threads probably from an early script that Del Toro had done. I don't think they were executed to the same way that Del Toro would have done it. And there were some very obvious, foreshadowings and stuff like that in the movie that are just cringy as hell, because you know what's going to happen. But at the same time, it's just, it's one of those movies that I feel like is going to be a microcosm, and I think it has become a microcosm, especially because the sequel did not do very well. Is that film really, it was lightning in a bottle at the moment when it was made, and for whatever reason, it just worked. It all just worked perfectly. And some people might criticize the story on it too and say, oh, it had kind of a weak story. It's like, look, I get it. The story's supposed to, facilitate giant robots beating up giant monsters, and I kind of get that. But I mean, you show me somebody who's going to make a better story than that. And honestly, I don't know if there could be, other than maybe 1980s-esque. James Cameron might have been the only other one that I could think of that could have pulled that off without it being corny or stupid or dumb. And now we're going to get to one of his more recent films, and one that he has garnered attention from the Academy of Motion Pictures for, and that is The Shape of Water. Now, I have not seen The Shape of Water. I don't plan on seeing The Shape of Water because The Shape of Water looks incredibly dumb. And if you like that movie, that is fine, but I'm sorry, I don't want to see a woman having sex with a fish man. It is really weird. It is really, 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 really weird. And I do not want to see that on screen. And I've read the synopsis of the movie just to see what happens. I figured, oh, well, maybe it's a platonic thing or whatever. Nope, she has sex with a fish man. Yeah, it's just, no. Like, look, I get it that maybe this was his, like, from Michael Keaton in Birdman. This was like his like Oscar movie. That this was his movie to try and appeal to the Oscar crowd, because for the most part he made popcorn movies and 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 foreign language horror movies for the most part. He didn't really necessarily make things that were going to garner for best picture. But maybe this was just like his attempt, and a lot of directors will do that. They'll after they've done a certain amount of things in their career, they'll say, all right, look, I want to win an Oscar, and I want to go do a movie that's going to win an Oscar. And I think that's what this was for him. I think he also has a very strange fixation with the Abe Sapien character, which is why he created that weird fish man for some reason. Because I don't know, maybe he fantasizes about having sex with mermen. I got no idea what's going on there, but I feel like this was his this was his Academy bid, and he won. He won Best Picture. I believe this movie won 4 Oscars. And look, I still like Del Toro as a director. I mean, I still like directors that make horrible, crappy, disgusting movies. But I can still enjoy the movies that are good. There's plenty of directors that have, they have missteps. And again, I wouldn't really consider this a misstep. I just personally don't like the idea of the movie, and it seems kind of stupid to me. But that's neither here nor there. But this ultimately, Guillermo del Toro as a director it's visual storytelling at one of its best, because he just puts you in that world that he wants you to be in, and you're invested. You're invested from the first 5 minutes of that movie on what's going to happen, and he pulls you right in, and he makes you part of that fairy tale. He makes you watch it, and you flow with it. And again, it's like reading something out of Grimm's fairy tales or a Mother Goose stories or something like that, with a dark spin on it in a lot of cases, and it's really very, very interesting. And if you are not familiar with some of Guillermo del Toro's or I shouldn't say lesser works, but lesser known works, I suggest you check them out. And really, I would suggest that you check out any of his movies, even The Shape of Water, even though I think it's kind of weird. Because it's still engrossing. It'll still get you to watch it, and it'll still make you want to watch it, because he makes his story so interesting, and he makes it so drawing for you to watch. So with that, I would like to close out this video. Please leave any comments or opinions on Guillermo del Toro or his work in the comment section below. And again, I'm only really going over his filmography in terms of movies. I'm not going over stuff like The Strain and stuff like that. But if you like that too, you can throw that in the comments. Hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?